Welcome to the third segment of our lectures on autonomy and privacy, and I want to talk about personal autonomy in this lecture and why it's important. Why is it important that people should be able to choose their way of life in the world by themselves and not be the tools of others? So why is it ethically important? Why is personal autonomy ethically important? Well, for one reason, it involves the same sort of mechanisms as moral autonomy, and it's therefore a precondition of moral agency and of moral accountability. So threats to personal autonomy can also be excusing conditions for moral accountability. So that's one reason why personal autonomy is important. The other big thing is that the requirement of personal autonomy is justified by many, if not most, other ethical theories. And in our ethical pluralist framework, we want to look at all the different theories and see what they have to say about the importance of autonomy. So starting this, we've talked about this. It's a precondition perhaps for the preservation of moral agency and moral accountability, but it also is important inside the will theory of rights. Remember, the will theory of rights is the idea that you have to be able to give your informed consent to any infringements of your personal rights, when people are not normally allowed to cut you open with a knife. But if you go into the hospital and you have to have an operation, then you give your informed consent to the surgeon opening you up and cutting little pieces out of you or whatever. Okay, so this is involves the will theory of rights that says that your claims on others are under your control. You can say how what other people can do to you or do to your property, and that involves this notion of informed consent, which requires personal autonomy. So it's the two things tie together. The interest theory of rights might also think of autonomy as a crucial interest, but well, it's a possibility, but I won't pursue that here. Another interesting justification for a right to personal autonomy is that it's required for anti-paternalism. So under a notion of indirect utilitarianism, you're trying to make everybody as happy as possible, trying to satisfy their preferences. But you don't want to do that, since you can't measure what people want or you can't see what makes them happy. The best way to do that is to allow them to choose for themselves what they want. People usually have the best information about themselves, and they make the best choices for themselves. So generally this is the case. Sometimes, of course, you can maybe give a paternalistic argument for making people happier by doing things for them they don't seem to want. But in general, and as a general rule, as a general form of utilitarianism that says, don't try and make the decisions case by case, but try to pick out a policy that will maximize happiness. And that policy is to respect people's choices, to respect their personal autonomy over what they want for themselves. And other reasons involve issues of justice. In order to for a policy to be legitimate, then you want to think that people weren't fooled or whatever into consenting to it. Autonomous consent is required for legitimate policy choices in a democracy. Virtue ethics, as we'll see, I'll show you, is a little bit more ambivalent here about the role of autonomy. Here's a chart of the different approaches to justifying personal autonomy. And when you look at virtue ethics, on the one hand, authenticity and the taking of personal responsibility are virtues, and they require personal autonomy. But on the other hand, virtues are are often centered in communities, right? There's a communitarian aspect to them, and people acquire obligations of virtue by membership in communities. And that means that there are certain choices that they can't make ethically because their community obligations determine their choices. So virtue ethics can be ambivalent. On one side, authenticity and personal responsibility. On the other side, community obligations. And just because you are a member of this community, you have an obligation to do such and such, and you do not have the autonomous choice of whether to do such and such. So the virtue ethics is ambivalent on the notion of personal autonomy, as is feminist ethics. Because on the one hand, feminist ethics valorizes personal autonomy as a counter to patriarchal oppression, to systems of cultural, oppressive cultural frameworks, etc. But on the other hand, feminist ethics also valorizes relationships, the importance of relationships. And by committing yourself to a relationship, you put a limit on your autonomy, right? Because when you are married, you can no longer do things that you could do when you were single. Now, you could say, well, this is a voluntary relationship that you've entered into, and so you've voluntarily given up certain aspects of personal autonomy. But it's also the case that you have relationships that you are not chosen, but that you are born into, like your relationship to your parents and to your siblings and to your family, and these sorts of relationships impose restrictions on your autonomy, and they, in feminist ethics, may say that, well, that's the way it should be. So again, feminist ethics goes both ways on personal autonomy. Motivation based, well, we've looked at the will theory and this importance of autonomous informed consent. It's also worth pointing out that special rights formed by contracts and promises also require autonomous consent. I have a right, if you promise to do something for me, then I have a right that you do it, but that promise is dependent on you freely choosing to make that promise. If you're coerced into making that promise, then I can hardly hold you obliged to fulfill that duty, right? Utilitarianism, again, can go both ways depending on what variety you pick on. Experience-based utilitarianism has no requirement of personal autonomy. All it requires is that you get lots of pleasure and minimal pain, and if to give you lots of pleasure we have to override your personal autonomy, tough luck. Preference-based utilitarianism, well, there could be a preference for autonomy, but the main point in favor of personal autonomy here is that the empirical, factual, possibly false statement that people make their own best choices. And in an indirect form where you don't try to judge everything act by act, but say, well, we better have a policy here. Then the best policy is probably to let people make their own choices and respect their personal autonomy. Economic utilitarianism has a whole model of rational maximizing agents, and that involves their ability to make autonomous choices about what they want. Economics would be very, very different if advertising were 100% effective. If economic agents were always susceptible to advertising and did what advertisers told them, then economics would be a very different subject than the one that we all study. The notion of a self-interested, rational, maximizing agent involves that agent being able to make autonomous choices between various options based on its own values or preferences. And finally, informed preference view of utilitarianism is certainly going to require that people have good information, and that's at least one of the requirements of personal autonomy. So we have a little bit, it's not like every ethical theory says personal autonomy is a good thing. Most of them do, maybe with the exception, say, of the experience-based utilitarianism and the ambivalence that's built into the communitarian aspect of virtue ethics and into the relationship aspect of feminist ethics. Finally, just some distinctions that we need to make just so that you can be clear about how autonomy, liberty, and liberty differ. Remember that a moral right is a morally justified claim on others, and a negative right is a general right not to be interfered with. A negative liberty is the right to have one's actions, and this is the important thing, to have one's actions not interfered with. A negative autonomy right, liberty is about action. A negative autonomy right is the right not to have your decision-making interfered with. Okay, see the difference? Actions versus decision-making. And of course, a positive right, autonomy rights, the right to assistance with one's decision-making, as is a positive Liberty right is the right to assistance with your actions. Okay, so just have those straight in your head. So which of the following is the best example of a negative autonomy right? This is what we're looking for, a negative autonomy right, and we're looking for a violation negative autonomy right. So have a look through those and see what you think is the best answer. Okay, let's have a look here. Negative autonomy, interference with decision making, and a violation of, a violation of a negative autonomy right is an interference with decision making, basically. And so let's have a look here. The supervisor says he will fire the employee unless the employee goes on a date with him. Okay, firing would be, says he will fire, that's a threat. It's coercive because, it's both something that will harm the employee, and it's not legitimate, right? The supervisor has no legitimate right to say this. So the supervisor may be able to do it, but it's illegitimate. And a coercive threat is the sort of thing that is an interference with autonomy. So that's a possibility. The security guard physically prevents the employee from leaving the premises. Leaving the premises is an action. So insofar as this is an interference, this is an interference with a liberty right, not an autonomy right. The supervisor promises a promotion. Well, that's a coercive offer. Or is an offer, maybe coercive, but it's probably it's potentially an interference, depending on what you think about but offers are a lot easier to refuse than threats. So given that this one is on board as a possibility, this one is probably not as good as this one. It's not as good an example. And this question, which you're probably getting, this distractor, which keeps popping up here, has got to do with privacy, it's got nothing to do with autonomy. So your best answer here is A, that the supervisor will fire the employee, a coercive threat, which is an interference with the decision-making of the employee. Okay, so I hope that gives you a little bit of a feeling for why personal autonomy is a value in many ethical systems and why some others are a little bit ambivalent about it.